Okay, I can start, Tamar.
Can you let me share my screen? Could you let me share my screen?
Yeah, I made you co-host now.
Okay, there, great. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So we are here to talk about weighing, and specifically weighing from top half. What are we going to have in this workshop? We're going to briefly talk about what weighing is and my philosophy about it, why it's basically my favorite thing to do in debate. Then going to go over some really basic types of weighing, just so that we all know exactly what I'm talking about and referring to. I'm going to talk about weighing from top half specifically because I think it's criminally underutilized in debate. So I'm going to talk about what that means, how you do it, and when you can incorporate it into your material. And then I'm going to talk through some examples just so that to explain how being specific to the motion in terms of weighing can be really, really important in concretizing that weighing and making it a debate-winning possibility. So what is weighing, and a little bit of my philosophy about it? Put very, very simply, weighing is just explaining my arguments and impacts are more important than other arguments and impacts in the debate. This is, when it boils down to it, my favorite part of debate, because I think it's really what it's about at the end of the day. It's not hoping someone else is going to make a mistake or someone else doesn't prove their points. It's just, given that everyone has reasons to do or not to do something, why should we take mine into account more than others? I also think it's kind of representative of real life, right? Like when there are things that you need to make a decision about in real life, often it's not that some other impact doesn't happen. Sometimes decisions we have pros and have cons, and we need to understand how to decide between those pros and cons. So I really think that at the heart of it, this is my favorite part of debate, because I feel like it's most representative of how we make decisions, actually. So that's why I love it a lot. Specifically in debate, I think it's important to think of weighing as both comparative and actively positive analysis. So often I see speakers giving a grocery list of reasons why our case is more important. Why? Because it harms the most amount of people, and we're showing you the biggest amount of harm. But that's not weighing. That's just, maybe I proved that I'm actually affecting more people, maybe I didn't. Why is that a reason that is more important than other reasons in the debate? It's not just this grocery list, it has to have analysis and justification behind it. So I have to explain why it is true that I'm actually affecting more people than other people. I have to actually prove and analyze why I care more about the group of people I'm talking about than other people. It's not just a grocery list that you can add on at the end of your speech and be like, yes, I proved this. No, you need to explain why it's true and why it's important, just like any other thing you're trying to prove in debate. It's also something that is always against something and requires some strategic thinking. So just saying, I harm a lot of people isn't enough. It's always a comparative analysis, because you always need to say, I'm harming more people than other teams are harming. Therefore, mine is more important. This means that you need to think about things strategically, and you can't just add on those headlines again, like I said. And impacts. I find that really giving concrete examples and explaining and breaking down your impacts when it comes to weighing, similar to how you would break down your impacts when you're trying to prove a point, is super helpful. I think sometimes people reach 90% of their case, but to really weigh it out properly and explain why it's important, people often miss the last 10%, which really explains what the impacts of things are. So I find this is really common in environmental debates, for example. People will reach a sort of broad impact of, and we're helping clean the planet or save the environment. And that's 90%, but you're missing the 10% of explaining what that looks like, what it feels like when you breathe dirty air, what impact it has on your body when you drink dirty water, and things like this. And incorporating that into your weighing is super helpful in concretizing and making sure people understand why what you're talking about is super important. The next thing to consider when it comes to weighing is that it should be considered from prep and not something that is an afterthought. And after you choose a case, you're like, okay, now how can we weigh this? Weighing and thinking it out from prep should be part of the strategic process and how you choose cases. You need to be able to choose cases that you can explain why they win in the debate and not try and explain why your case wins after you've chosen it. So making sure you're discussing and thinking of weighing and how things win in a debate in which properly is really helpful to making sure you choose the right case in the first place and makes your life easier in debate. And I find that thinking about that through weighing is very helpful in making sure I make those decisions well. And the last and most important thing to remember is, just like everything else in debate, there isn't some magic weighing that will automatically win balance. There isn't anything that's going to be so intuitively more important or that you can explain is so much more important than everything else that you're just going to automatically win. What I'm showing you today is how I go about weighing, but obviously, just like anything else, the more skilled and the more nuanced and the more specific you are at weighing, that's going to be better than other weighing in the debate. But it's important to remember magic, and it's not just something that's automatically better than anything else. So moving on to some basic weighings and terminology that I find very helpful to think about. These 4 headlines are broadly how I think about weighing when I try to explain why something is more important than another. It's important to recognize that these are headlines, and in order for them to work in a motion, they have to be specific to a specific motion, and it's important to explain how they are relevant to a specific motion, but we'll get into that. So the first kind of weighing I'd like to talk about is like talking about why do we win? Because we show you the harm with most certainty, or we show you that this affects most people. Why is certainty something that is convincing? Think about it this way. If someone asked you to drive them to the airport randomly and was like, I'll pay you $200 to do it, when are you more likely to do something? When they pay you $100 in advance and $100 after you do it, or when they say, I'll just pay you all of the money when we're done? I think the first is more convincing because you're more sure that you're necessarily going to get that benefit. Because you're more certain of it, it's more convincing for you to take action, and that's why we find certainty and likelihood convincing. I like to think of this in terms of commonality. It's certain because it can either it's more certain and you've proved that it's more likely, or it just happens the most. It's most common in time, so it happens in a situation that happens to most people, or to people many times over. If it's something you experience daily, or it's situations that come up daily, then the likelihood of things happening goes up. Or it's very common for many people. So many people are going to experience this. This means if we aggregate in some weird way the harm, damage, or alternatively benefit that happens to people, it happens to many people, and therefore that makes it quantity-wise happens a lot. The other side of this coin is obviously extent, and I'm going to talk about it in terms of quality, right? So why is extent something that's super convincing? If we think about why we get vaccinated or why we take any form of medication that might have side effects, we ask ourselves what side effects are worth it because of the harms that we're preventing. So the more harmful something is, or the more beneficial it is, the more it is likely to justify taking action that might have some harms, but those harms are lesser than. So the more I can prove that my impact is big and the extent is, the more important it becomes to either make sure it happens or make sure it doesn't happen. The way I think of this is just the basic is extent of damage or benefit. So if it's something that's very, very harmful to people, we like to talk and debate about dead babies. So the more I can prove that happening, that babies die, that is a horrible, horrible thing. And even if it happens to a few amount of people, it's something we want to prevent. The next thing is long term. So if it happens in the long term and it's something that will continue to happen, then if you aggregate that, that's a lot of harm. And I also like to think about two things, which are reversibility or irreversibility. So there are some harms that we have ability to roll back and fix, as opposed to harms that we don't have the ability to roll back and fix, and controllability. So do we have an ability to stop and control this and take preventatory action or mitigatory action in the process? So for example, if something is going to cause economical harms, I can claim that we have all sorts of checks and balances and processes in place to mitigate and control the extent of those harms. So we have a central bank that can decide to either raise or lower interest rates. We have the ability, might be difficult, but we have the ability to raise taxes. We have the ability as governments to create more workplaces if we want to, and we have the ability to give people stipends. So it's more controllable and we can take action to mitigate it and prevent it from happening. So all of those things are things I think about when talking about extent. Now, sharp people will notice that these are two sides of the same coin, and at the end of the day, we're talking about expected value. 5 times 4 is the same as 10 times 2. So if I prove 5 harm to 4 people, or if I prove 10 harm to 2 people, at the end of the day, in a weird world in which we aggregate harm, which is what we do a lot in debate, we reach at the end of the day the exact same thing. This is important to note because that's why it's never enough to just say, oh, but on our side, we harm more people. That's not necessarily more convincing, yes, but on our side, we harm fewer people, but we harm them more. If you're using one of these in order to weigh, you always need to try and reach the bottom line of why the extent of harm I'm showing, given how many people experience this, or even if it's small, the extent of harm I'm showing is still enough to beat the other side. That's always something to notice, and you always have to add that as part of your analysis or as part of your weighing to make sure that this can be a debate winning measure and not just something you're throwing out that doesn't have a lot of weight to it. The next is asking myself, who is affected in this debate and why do I care about them in this debate the most? So some guiding questions for these specifically is, who am I in this debate and what are my duties and moral obligations? So in the debate about parenting, there might be, or in the debate about schools, there might be impacts on how parents behave or impacts on the children themselves or impacts on the teachers. And if I want to prioritize one or more of those, I can explain why my duties as the specific person in the debate are to children or teachers or parents, depending on who I am. So for example, if I am a school, then I can claim that my first and foremost duty and obligation is to the children, because my existence is justified only by how much I actively benefit them. So, or if I am debating from the perspective of a parent, I can claim that my moral obligation is to my children, because their existence is dependent on me, and I need to make sure, in order for the action of bringing a child into the world to not be immoral, I need to make sure that I make their life as good as possible. So those are ways of thinking about who I am in the debate and why my moral obligation is to X group. This is a way to sort of bypass extent of harm or quantity of harm, because it means I don't need to prove either of those things. I just need to prove that in this specific instance, even if the group I care about is being harmed less, it's my direct obligation or duty to prevent harm to them, and therefore it's just more important, even if some other group is being hurt more. The second question is, what is the unique impact on this group of people? So maybe the debate impacts a specific group of people more than other people, and therefore that makes them more important because other people have a way of reaching other things as opposed or reaching things. So in the debate about sports, for example, there's always clashes on how it impacts fans versus how it impacts players. Possibly, look, fans have the ability to get entertainment or have a feeling of belonging or everything else that we get from sports in other places. But people whose livelihood is directly dependent on sports don't have that ability and can't just move away from sports because they've put a lot of time and effort in it, certain amounts here, and that's why we should prioritize the athletes themselves as opposed to the fans. That's an example of how unique impacts can be tied back to weighing specific groups over other people. And the last one, and this is really important, is vulnerability. This is one of those ways which I hear just thrown out and not justified as the most in debates, because I think we have a little bit of a bias in debates to just assume that people who are vulnerable and oppressed should automatically have an advantage or should automatically be prioritized. Putting aside personal belief, I just think in debate, without actively explaining why we need to prioritize vulnerable people, can leave you vulnerable in return, because often these people tend to be minorities, or at least minorities in the country from which they come from. And in that case, a different team can just get up and say, hey, newsflash, guess what? Minorities are minorities. There are less of them, therefore there are less people. So in order to not be vulnerable to that response, you need to actually justify why we want to prioritize them. This could be anything from, and you can use anything else we've talked about to prioritize them. You can talk about how they don't have access to the same mechanisms that prevent harm than other groups, because any small amount on them is amplified, because the meaning of, I don't know, $100 that they don't get can be a difference in being able to get to work if your car breaks down. So all of these things can be explained, but I think they should be explained. And I think this is the kind of weighing I hear the most, where people sort of shortcut it and just say, oh, we should prioritize them because they're vulnerable, without actively explaining why that vulnerability directly means that we should prioritize them. So this is the question of who is affected. The next is a question of logical priority. And I think I find it helpful to think about this in two ways. So the classic is, you didn't prove this burden. Without this burden, your impacts don't happen. Therefore, I'm going to analyze this, and it's going to be logically prior, because without us, your case just doesn't stand. Another way of thinking about this is, without our case, your impacts don't matter. It's not that they don't accrue. It's not that you don't get to them. It's that their point, or what they're achieving, is worthless unless we prove our case as well. So I think one of the places I see this a lot is in social justice debates, and there are debates about how social justice movements should propagate their ideas. So most recently at the Ukraine Charity Open, I believe, there was a motion on whether feminist movements should propagate capitalist ideas. And one of the cases in the debate was because more people find it convincing. But that's getting to 90% of the impact. You need to be able to translate something being more convincing to people actively taking action about it. This is where, if someone goes in and analyzes, look, maybe people are convinced, but if they do nothing, there are so many beliefs that I hold that I don't do anything about. I don't go necessarily to every protest that I would otherwise believe in. I don't give money to any cause that I otherwise believe in, for a variety of reasons that I'm not going to analyze. So what you need to prove is that once you've convinced people, they're actually also going to take action. This is an example of how, without that case, your impacts don't matter, because I agree with you that you've convinced a lot of people, but what matters is what they do after they're convinced in order to get to change. I see this kind of logically prior weighing used less and utilized less than without our case, your impacts don't happen. And I think it's a shame, because I think it is less dependent on people missing burdens, or such important burdens that their case doesn't stand without them. So shifting to that mode of thought just opens another way of weighing to me, and another way of thinking about it that I wouldn't necessarily otherwise have thought of. So it's a good question to ask myself. Lastly, and this is incredibly useful for top half, is a weighing I call sufficiency. It's basically saying, there are no gaps in my analysis. There is nothing to extend on. This is basically, this, different to other weighings, doesn't have to be added positive analysis. It's basically just a really quick recap of all of the burdens I hit. This is just so the judges go through a mental checklist of saying, right, they have done all of these things and they haven't missed anything on the way to their impacts. That means that even if bottom half gets up and says, look, our top half is missing this burden, the judge has already has in their head, oh no, they don't actually miss this burden. They have actually analyzed on this. Personally, I like to add at the end of my speech, literally the sentence, here is why it's going to be really hard for bottom half to extend on us, because we've already proven X, Y, and Z. And once you go through those things, it is actively harder for bottom half to extend on you. And you'll see many bottom half teams being like, oh no, have they actually proven all this, and start to struggle. So these are the main ways that I think of weighing, just the basic headlines before we delve deeper into how to do this more specifically. I know that mainly this is being recorded, but if there are any questions about this part of the workshop, I'm very happy to take them now, either in chat or just speak up. Just gonna wait like 10 seconds to see if anything comes up. And if not, I'll move to talking about specifically top half weighing and why I think it's incredibly important and underutilized. I think that should be around 10 seconds. Hopefully no questions means I'm being incredibly clear. So let's move on to top half weighing. Why is it important to weigh from top half? The first is it's our only way to sort of mitigate an inherent disadvantage that top half has. So top half's main disadvantage is I can't react. I can't, after I hear what bottom half has to say, I can't say, oh no, actually what you're saying is less important. I can't rebut what they're going to say. So even if I think they're missing something in analysis or there's a reason why they're wrong, I don't really have an opportunity to say it, and POIs aren't necessarily enough. So I have to be proactive. I have to do this in advance. I have to explain why what I'm saying wins the debate, because if someone else does it after me, I'm not going to have the opportunity to do anything about it. The second reason why it's important is because weighing against weighing is really hard and people are really bad at it. This means that a little goes a really long way for a top half win. It's easier for me to think of reasons why something is important, and even reasons why something is more important than something else, than thinking of reasons why my reasons are better than your reasons. It becomes really complicated, which means that once I've weighed from top half, I am forcing bottom half to think of more complex ideas, and I'm forcing them to waste time in trying to weigh above my weighing. If I don't weigh from top half, then they don't have to waste that time, and time is an incredibly useful resource in debate. So making sure I do that from top half makes it harder for bottom half and makes their work in weighing over me and explaining why what they're doing is important a lot harder. Obviously, given that time is an incredibly important resource in debate, you have to ask yourself whether you should be weighing versus matter dumping and versus rebuttal. So versus matter dumping, why should you spend more time analyzing weighing when you can analyze on more metrics? So the first answer is complexity. This is a personal preference, and I know that current meta in debate doesn't work with this necessarily, and matter dumping has become, I find it harder to explain, four different cases that have four different impacts, then explaining why each of those wins and having a coherent strategy is just a lot harder. So weighing when I can, instead of just analyzing four more cases, is a lot easier, and I find that I can do it significantly more robustly. So if I'm not worried about and doing all of them, but probably doing them less in depth, I find it personally more easy to just make sure I am weighing out in an airtight way why my case or two cases that I've chosen have won. The second is it leaves you less vulnerable. Maybe you've analyzed a lot of things, but given that you're analyzing a lot of things and it's likely to be less robust, you're always going to leave something, some burden, some material, some case, some group of people, some kind of harm that bottom half is going to be able to analyze. And if you haven't weighed or explained why yours are more important, it leaves an opening for bottom half to maybe analyze less, but explain why the thing that they're analyzing is more important. And if they do that, it doesn't matter that all they have left is a single case. It doesn't matter that all they have left is one mechanism. If that single case or that single mechanism is what is most important in the debate, then it doesn't matter that they say less. They've said the important bit, and that's why they win. So making sure you weigh the content you already have is incredibly important to making sure that the content you've given actually wins the debate and isn't just a lot of words. Versus rebuttal, I always prefer to weigh if possible. Why? Mainly because it's more time efficient. If I can agree with everything the other team has said, and I don't have to take it apart, and I don't have to focus, and I don't have to listen to every single line of analysis and think of answers in real time. I can literally just, look, I agree with everything you've said. You've proven all of your points, but it's just less important than what I had to say. That takes me significantly less time and makes them significantly more vulnerable. I find the better the room I'm seeing and the more competent and the less likely to make mistakes in analysis the other teams I'm up against, the less trying to rebut everything is actually useful and the less it's going to be effective, because they're really going to miss a crucial burden and they're going to think of good and nuanced reasons why what they're saying is true. So making sure I have weighing versus just trying to rebut what they're saying is very, very useful. And the last thing I'll say, because I think it's relevant, is especially as an ESL speaker against EPL teams, with the amount of words that they're saying and the speed in which people are speaking, I apologize, but I just don't understand all of it always necessarily. And I found that playing to my strengths in weighing and being time efficient versus making sure I understand every sentence and panicking when I don't get it is also useful, because again, I don't have to listen to anything. I just assume you proved your case. I'm not even going to argue with you about it. I'm just going to weigh it out and explain why it's just not important. So what does it mean to weigh from top half versus for going further a second than the headlines and basic kinds of weighings that we already discussed? So the first thing I try and notice is ask myself, is there a built-in trade-off or some clash in the debate that's going to go clearly on my side of the debate, and then I can weigh against it? So if there's a debate about practical outcomes or legitimacy, for example, again, from Ukraine Charity Open, because that's the competition I most recently did, is on having national referendums for heavy industrial projects. So Gov side intuitively is going to talk about legitimacy because referendums and voting often includes that, and opposition side is going to talk about practicalities and how hard it is to have national referendums and what horrible decisions people make. Once I've noticed that in prep and once I've thought about it in the debate, I can already weigh against other things. I can explain why legitimacy or democracy in this specific case is just more important than the practical outcomes. And you can do that in many reasons. You can explain why there isn't an actual better practical outcome in many cases, because there isn't just an intuitive better outcome between environment and economics. Or you can explain why you're logically prior, anything we talk about, but once you know that clash is coming, once you know that there's one on your side, you can weigh between them. I just want to point out that this can often be very useful against bottom half, because I find strategy that bottom half teams often do is they recognize from prep that, okay, this is intuitive to Gov and this is intuitive to Op. Our OG is going to win on what's intuitive to Gov. We're going to defeat Op position on their own metric. If you've already weighed over that metric and you've already weighed over opposition metric, then you're already putting your bottom half team in a harder place, because they now not only have to beat opposition on their metric, they also have to weigh that metric above what you've already set up and weighed against. So often using that weighing is going to be effective, not just in winning the opposite team or the opposite bench, but it's also going to be useful in beating your bottom half if that is in fact the strategy they chose. The second thing is sufficiency, which we already discussed, but I think is important, and I think is important to take into account in advance and think, okay, what are the 4 burdens we're hitting, and make sure you're mentioning all of them. And the last thing I get asked sometimes is, but if you're running more than one case, usually you're proving more than one impact, how do you weigh? I also find this difficult and confusing, because if I say one thing is more important, then why am I talking about another thing suddenly? And what is the other metric? If it's less important, why am I even talking about it? Usually how I like to set this up and what I do is I set up a main metric and then I say even if. So In the national referendum example, this would be, look, we prove that this is the only legitimate thing to do, and therefore we have an obligation to do it. And this is the most important thing in the debate. But even if you don't buy that, here we have a case on this other practical outcome that is also going to win the debate if you think that's more important. So if I'm weighing and making sure I'm weighing things off, that's usually how I do it. Now, when? Yes, when. This is really within the speech when I like to present things. So, and there are all sorts of different ways of doing it and different places of putting it in your speech. So I'm going to briefly go through where I put them in. So my favorite is at the top of my speech as deputy, usually, but like first speakers can also do this, is really just spell out, this is how we win the debate. So I can start my speech and say, look, open and government are winning by doing two things. A, we prove this is the only legitimate course of action in cases of heavy industrial projects. But B, we're also going to show you that this is going to lead to more positive impacts for the people involved. Then immediately I'll answer, why do we win if we prove this? And that's where I'll put in my weighing. That's where I'll explain. Because democracy is logically prior to any other decision the state needs to make, or because we are showing you we're affecting the group most directly harmed by the motion, therefore everything else has other alternatives, or any other of the weighings we talked about, but usually I'll try to put it at the top of my speech. This is especially effective if I think that my partner has already successfully set out a case and there isn't a lot of added work I need to do to rebuild. If that's not the case and I need to rebuild our main case and I need to talk to bring it back in, or I need to save it from after some horrible rebuttal from opening opposition, then I'll do it after the rebuilding. So I'll say, look, this is what this is how we're proving things. How do we prove it? Then I'll rebuild, I'll add analysis where we were missing analysis, I'll answer the rebuttal that we received and explain why it's still standing. And then I'll say, now that we've proven this, this is why it wins the debate. And I'll really just say that sentence. This is why this wins the debate, and that's where I'll put in my weighing. Another option is just after rebuttal. I think especially when you're comparing things like likelihood and extent, or when you're giving rebuttal that is mitigation and not necessarily just takes down the other case. It's really important to set out, okay, so now after I've done this, what is the comparison now and why do we win it? So if I have really mitigated the other side's case, I can point out, look, they claimed that their harms are really, really horrible, but I've just shown you that they're not horrible. In that case, the question becomes not where we're harming people more, but where we're harming more people because the extent of damage is the same on both sides. Once you think of it that way and you add that sentence, it becomes a better way to credit and make sure the judges understand what the bottom line of mitigatory rebuttal is. So I find that very, very useful. Another option is obviously after additional material. So say you run additional material or you ran another case, then you can explain, and this is why my additional analysis wins the debate. And the last option, and it's my least favorite option because it's where you're most likely to forget about it, but obviously it depends on personal style, is at the end of your speech. So you do everything you need to do, you give the added analysis, you do the rebuttal, and you've proven all your things, and then at the end you explain, and this is how this wins the debate. This is my least favorite option for two reasons. Like I said, you're most likely to forget about it. But second is because often it becomes confusing because at that point you're trying to weigh all of your cases or all of your things at once, as opposed to at the end of each separately explaining why it's important and why it should win the debate. Which I just think is a more organized way of thinking about it and makes it clearer both to me and usually to the judges why my weighing is actually effective. So how do I do this? Just some practical ideas as to how to make sure you're doing things. A guiding question I like to ask myself is, if I prove X, I win. Why do I win? The answer to that question is the weighing. So this is really spelling out to yourself your paths to victory and why this wins. Notice that this is a thing I do from prep. It's because it helps choose the case or burdens to focus on in the first place. So if you take a case and you ask yourself, but why does this win? And you don't have an answer, then probably you can't win with that case, because if you can't explain why it wins, then the judges don't know why it wins, and we don't know why it wins. But if you have a bunch of cases and with one of them you're like, oh no, I can explain why this wins, this is the most important or the most relevant group or anything else we discussed, that's how you can choose a case. So it's really important to discuss and think of in prep and ask yourself that question in prep already, because it's really going to make sure you choose the right case in the first place and make your life in the debate and set it up a lot more easily. The next thing I do is I literally write out on a page the basic weighings I discussed earlier. I just have a page where I go weighing 1, 2, 3, 4, all of the headlines, all of the options. And at some point in prep or before my speech, I look at it and I think, okay, which are best suited to this specific motion? How can I use them? And I look at them. And I ask what is best suited to my needs and my position in the motion. And then I make them specific to the motion. And this is an important part of the process that I'll focus on in my next section, which is talking through some examples and showing you exactly what it means to make things specific to the motion. Before I continue to the examples, I will give another opportunity to ask some questions, or if anything wasn't clear, or if I haven't answered something that you find important. So feel free to just speak up, or again, use the chat. Great, awesome. So if not, just going to go directly into some examples. So motion is, this house would teach children in school great man history rather than process history. You're opening government, and you need to think from prep already, how am I going to weigh this? What are the clashes? What are the things I'm going to focus on? So in this specific case, I want to talk about preemptively weighing a case about children being more engaged. So you can claim here that children need to be engaged in order to gain anything from class in the first place. This is an example of logical priority in which your impacts don't really happen without hours. Any case that says that it's better to teach kids specific lessons on either side of the debate, so that's comparing the kind of messaging or the kind of lessons children internalize when you're teaching great man history or when you're teaching process history, have to go through the burden of proving that children will be engaged enough to learn those lessons in the first place. So if you take a case about children are more engaged on our side of the motion, and then you use the weighing of logical priority to say, look, really any other case is first dependent on this. So versus my bottom half, if I've proven that children will actually be engaged, even if they prove that that's a good thing, they'd have to go through our burden first. And versus oppositions, if they want to prove that it's better for them to learn lessons about through process history, then I've already answered it and said, yeah, maybe those lessons would have been ideal, but they won't learn on your side at all because they're not engaged in the learning process in general. I can really use this weighing to set out a strong case from opening governments that people are going to need to work hard to explain why it's less important than proving those things are positive in the first place. So this is an example of taking logical priority weighing and asking myself, how can I take this and make it specific to the motion, and making sure I analyze why that's true. Now, obviously, you do need to analyze why it's true. You need to analyze, obviously, as a case, why children are more engaged on your side, but also within the weighing, you should be analyzing why it's true that when children aren't engaged, they don't learn those lessons in the first place. You need to explain why maybe in order to learn applicable lessons, children need to continue to think about it and be able to generalize and understand which situations in the world today the lesson they learned in history can be relevant to. And in order to do that, they need to be engaged enough to remember or to recognize patterns or to ask themselves those questions in the first place. All of this is analysis, but it's analysis that should be done within that weighing to prove that it is true and to prove that it's important. So it's important to notice not only that weighing needs to be specific to the motion, but also that it is genuinely an analytical process, and it's not just saying, look, everything else is dependent on us. You need to prove why that's necessarily true. Next example. This house believes that it is in the interest of independent secessionist movements to prioritize creating autonomous zones within pre-existing countries over full-on statehood. I think this was at KCL at some point, but I'm not sure. You're once again OG. What do you run and how do you weigh it? So first, there's a potential trade-off that's sort of written into the motion or that's implied by the motion. There can be what we actually want to achieve more. So the ideal given success would be, are we actually happy with autonomous zones, or are we happier with statehood, and which of those would be ideal? And there's also the likelihood of success, where we're more likely to succeed. Are we more likely to succeed creating an autonomous zone, or are we more likely to succeed in creating a state? You can weigh the ideal and why the ideal is more important over likelihood, because if you hit the burden that success is meaningless without showing that what you're succeeding at is a good thing, then that's logically prior to analyzing whether it's better to have an autonomous, whether you're more likely to get an autonomous zone or you're more likely to get statehood. In this specific instance, you can analyze why the process of getting full statehood means that you're super dependent on your home country anyways, but now they're against you. So they're not going to give you access to all sorts of things you need to get on. They're not going to give you access to supply chains. They're not going to give you access to ports or airports or everything that you need, or funding or any sort of support in order to get to the impact you want. It's basically asking the question, if you were to achieve statehood but have it in the middle of the desert without the ability to actually act upon your autonomous needs, that is meaningless. Therefore, on one side of the debate, success is meaningless, and on the other side of the debate, success gives you the ability to achieve what you set out to do. What this says is your impacts are meaningless. It's different. Your impacts don't happen. It's just that your impacts are meaningless. Say you succeed at getting a state. That means nothing if we prove to you that your ability to actually act upon your needs, ideas, or autonomous needs, or to act upon the culture you want to represent, or anything like that is impossible on one side of the debate. And the fact that you've succeeded doesn't actually get what you want it to get, and that means that impact is meaningless without the additional analysis. I think this is a good example of how you can take your impacts are meaningless without ours and that kind of weighing, and explain why it's true in a specific instance, in a specific motion. The next example is about savior siblings. So for the purposes of this debate, a savior sibling is a child who is born through IVF, primarily for the purpose of providing an organ or cell transplant to a sibling who is affected with a fatal disease. This house would ban the creation of savior siblings, and you're OO. So you need to argue that savior siblings are actually important. So inherently, again, within this motion is a sort of claim that there are two children suffering. One of them is the sick child, and the other is the savior sibling that is born to sort of save that child. There are all sorts of things to run in this debate. There are all sorts of things to run in this debate. It can be, you can run what their life actually looks like, or how much suffering it is, or what the meaning of life is in the first place. But if you recognize that you can trade off the suffering of the savior sibling versus the suffering of the sick child, then you can weigh the suffering of the sick child in advance as more important as the suffering of the savior sibling. This means that even if governments analyze that the savior siblings suffer a lot, I don't have to disagree with that. I can just say, you know what, you're right, they are probably going to suffer and it sucks, but also it's less important that they're suffering than that the sick child is suffering in the first place. And you can analyze that in several ways. You can talk about the ability to prepare for that harm, both from the parents and from the child, and know what's coming and be able to prepare for it in some way, whereas a sick child is just sick and has no ability and no control over how much they're going to be harmed. there is a sense of meaning behind that harm and behind your suffering. One of those is for no good reason, just because I have bad luck and I'm sick. The other is I'm suffering in order to save my sibling, and that means I'm better able to understand and go through it. There's possible mitigation of harm, preparation parents can do, things I can take, getting myself familiar with what the recuperation process is going to be like. There's also just the known endpoints. I am going to go through this operation and it's going to take X weeks of suffering, and I know that it's going to end, whereas the sick child doesn't have that thing because they're just sick. And if it's incurable to the extent that you need to save your sibling, then you don't have hopes of it ending at all. All of those things are actually just proving extent of harm, right? Except in a motion-specific way. I'm saying that it's more reversible, the harm. I'm saying that there are mitigations to that harm, which means it's more controllable. I'm saying that it is less harmful because if there's a sense of meaning to it, it's easier for me to go through. All of these things are analyses on why the extent of harm to the sick sibling is larger than the extent of harm to the savior sibling. So it's taking that headline of extent and explaining it in a motion-specific way. And notice that it is active analysis. It's not enough for me to just claim, because the savior sibling is harmed less. I need to analyze and give reasons as to why that's true, and do that in a motion-specific way, and then point out that, look, what I'm actually proving to you here is that the extent of harm is larger on one side of this motion. And once you do that, it goes a long way to solidifying your position in the debate and makes it a lot harder for teams to just run on, oh, look, but it's going to be very harmful to the savior sibling, because you've already said, yes, I accept it, but also it doesn't matter. Another thing that I want to point out about this debate, because I think it's important, is that another thing you can run here is just to claim that some life is better than no life. So explaining why even if you suffer a little bit in life, there are things that are worth suffering for, and there are things that still make us want to be alive. The experience of having social connections, of being loved by my family, of listening to music or viewing nature. There are many things that can make life still good and still worth living. But then obviously the claim is, no, but like not having that benefit is neutral, it's not active harm. So I want to just point out something that I think people sometimes miss in debate, which is lack of benefit is active harm. So often in defamation suits, or to prove that some damage has happened, if we think about this through the legal system, you have to show, look, there was an opportunity cost here. Like someone lied about me and that meant I lost work that I would otherwise have had. That's not a neutral claim, that is active damage. If I had the ability to gain something and I would have gained it if this didn't happen, that is an active loss. So if I show you that, no, we don't want to ban savior siblings because we think that even if they suffer a bit, their life is still worth living, and preventing the chance for them to be alive is a bad thing because we're causing active harm, it's not neutral, that's just another way to think about it. I think I get asked sometimes, but how do you weigh a thing? How do you weigh a benefit against a harm? You just flip it. Lack of benefit is a harm, and then you weigh between the harm in the opportunity that you lost versus other harms in the debate. So I think that's another thing to point out here. And lastly, for the I want to talk about green central banking. So this had a very long info slide, but the important and relevant part here is, for the purposes of this debate, green central banking would support climate-friendly policies, even at the expense of traditional monetary objectives, such as targeting inflation rates, ensuring financial stability and market efficiency, as well as retaining neutrality of intervention. And this House supports green central banking. You are opening government. So you may have already noticed that there is a literal trade-off written into your position in this debate. You have to accept harm to monetary objectives because you have to accept that green central banking would support climate-friendly policies even at the expense of traditional monetary objectives. At this point, you should be able to recognize that you have no choice. So obviously, there's going to be some monetary harm. You can analyze why you can mitigate it. You can analyze why it's not as big, but you do have to explain, you have to accept some of it. So how can you go about weighing that once you've recognized it? So I think this can exemplify all of the different things that you can do. So extent, in this case, I spoke about reversibility and the fact that we have the ability and why we're likely to bail out countries who are going to take this stance, and other countries have an active incentive to prevent them from going under because of the way economies are interconnected, as opposed to we don't yet have the technology and it's not yet feasible to just take pollution out of water or filter all of the air that people are breathing in the world. We don't have that ability. So on one side, reversibility is hard. On the other side, reversibility is impossible. That's proving extent, because if something is reversible, the extent of harm it causes is lesser than something that's just irreversible. Then there's likelihood of harm. You can talk about preventability and control. So you can talk about exactly the kind of economical checks and balances that you can prevent as a country, and you have that ability. So you can raise taxes if you want to sort of control the financial things, or like I said, you can control interest rates. Is it hard? Yes, but notice that we don't have the ability to prevent and control environmental harms for many reasons. The technology, for example, doesn't always exist in a lot of the situations. And in this case, we'd be promoting exactly that kind of research and technology. It's just one example. There's also logical priority. So here is where you can focus on impacts and explain why the harms caused to people by the environmental harms, things like the medical costs of breathing dirty air or drinking dirty water, and the ability that you don't have access to enough food to keep you healthy, means that you need to spend a lot of money in order to be healthy and work and be able to gain those things. What this means is that if we show you our harms, then most people aren't going to be able to access the benefits of a good economy in the first place. So to them, it doesn't make a difference if the economy is good or the economy is bad. Their economical situation is bad because they have to spend money. So you can explain why it's just logically prior. Another way of doing this is just explaining why not having green technology or not promoting this is going to cause active economic harm. That's a more classic way of doing it. And lastly, you can even bring in who are we affecting here and talk about why a lot of the impacts and a lot of the harms from environmental issues are caused to more vulnerable communities or people who have less of an ability to bounce back, versus a lot of economic harms which most directly influence people who are wealthy and people who who are losing money because markets go down or because they have to pay interest rates, and why they're more able to sort of take in those damages and those harms versus people who are affected by this. So I think this is just a good example of emotion that you can really take all of the basic weighings I discussed in the first section and take them and explain specific to this specific motion, how they work, what is the analysis behind it, what does that weighing look like? And I think it really exemplifies how weighing requires analysis and requires you to prove all of these things are true in a specific to the motion way, which means it's positive. So the main takeaways that I would be happy if you just thought about after this workshop is just pointing out that top half weighing is incredibly powerful and very often underutilized. I think it's because people are more used to thinking of weighing from bottom half in top half have already proved things, so now I need to explain why mine is more important. But I think weighing from top half can make that a lot harder for bottom half teams, and it's really underutilized. And even just making sure it's in your mind and you're in that mindset when you're thinking of cases and when you're thinking in prep and when you're thinking about what to do as deputy or first speaker or why it's winning, it means you're more likely to do it. And once you do it, the chances of a bottom half team being able to beat you go down. The second thing is that weighing really starts from prep, and it's an important part of the strategic decision-making process. It's not just an afterthought, it's something you should take into account before choosing your case and before deciding which burdens to focus on, because it makes sure you focus on things that are winning you the debate and are not just nice to have. Next is that weighing is analysis and not a grocery list. So I said this a couple of times throughout this workshop, and I'll say it again. It's really important to recognize that it's not enough to just say something is more important. You need to say that why it's more important or why it's necessarily true. And weighing is motion specific. So you need to explain why it's true in this specific case, and you need to choose the weighing that best suits your motion and your position, and not just talk about things in abstract headlines of causing more harm, but explaining what more harm looks like in your specific motion and why it should be taken into account that way. So those are the main things and the main bottom lines from this workshop. I'm going to stop sharing now. I hope everyone here finds it helpful, and everyone who watches this after will find it helpful, and feel free to ask questions. Yes. I don't know if you're raising your hand, the question,
Yeah,
or yes.
sure. So my name is Andrews, and I attempt to weigh in most instances, but I think the struggle is really not with identifying maybe what weighing metric you want to use, but probably the analysis to prove that that weighing is either the right weighing or you sufficiently meet the demands of that weighing. So what I would like to know is maybe do you have thought processes that sometimes speakers should go through to see whether they are, or literally let's say check boxes to see whether you meet the dense of analysis that you need to sufficiently defend the weighing metric.
So I think I mentioned this. The thought process that I specifically do is, first, I literally write out all of the possible weighings I can think about. So I write out the headlines, but then I break them down. I'll say extents, and then I'll write down, okay, so there's reversibility, there's uniqueness, there's impacts, and there's preventability and control. And I'll take likelihood, and I'll do that, and I'll take logical priority, and I'll write down, okay, it's their impacts don't happen or their impacts don't matter. And once I have it all written down in front of me on a page, then I will try and connect it, and I'll try to recognize, okay, these are the things I can take. And once I take those things and I mark them down for myself, I just find it a lot easier. So the first thing I would do is just have a checklist. Really, I think for last Euros, I basically just had a same page I would take with me to every debate that I could look at and just have all the things. That means I'd have to spend less time trying to remember what works or trying to remember what my toolbox is, and it's just right in front of me. So I don't have to spend time remembering. I can just look at the page. So that's the first thing I would do. And the second thing I would do is really just think of it as another point. That's how I think of weighing. It's like proving anything else in a debate. So think of it in that way. Think of what your burdens are. Think the two questions that I swear by are, why is this true and why is it important? And I just answer those things in my weighing as well. So if I claim this is more reversible, I explain, why is it true that it's more reversible? And then I explain, why is it important that it's more reversible in that sense? So I guess those two things, that the checklist and the guiding questions of why is it true and why is it important, are things that I found helpful. I hope that answers your question and you'll find it helpful.
Yeah, it does. Can I ask a final one?
Yeah, sure, happily.
Awesome. So this is probably more related to international relations debates where there are multiple actors at play. And so you can pick and choose which actor you probably want to discuss. And so most of the time you are caught in a loop where you'd have to weigh the interests of one actor above the interest of another, or I don't know, it's mostly, I find myself in a situation where one team picks probably the US, another team picks China, another team picks Russia, and how they react to this. And so how do you use weighing to sort of help prevent a situation where your actor becomes less relevant, or I don't know, it's a bit confusing, but
No, I get it. I think the first thing I would do is really work hard at answering why in this specific case or why in this specific motion. and working through specificity. So there are some cases or some areas of the world in which the US probably has an advantage and we care about what the US does. But there are other cases and other areas in the world where we'll care about what China does and we'll care about what they do. Or you can think about what their unique addition or the unique thing they're adding into this motion is. And I think if you first ask yourself that question and then pick the actor to talk about, that will help solve your problem. Because sometimes what happens is we pick an actor, we're like, oh, okay, China has to do with this. But we don't answer to ourselves the question of, yes, but why is China most important in this specific instance? So we end up choosing an actor that we don't have an answer to, yes, but why are they more important? And if you first ask yourself who is the most important person, and then choose that actor to talk about, that you're more likely to choose the more relevant actor. And by specifying things to the motion, you're more likely to be able to weigh them successfully.
Sure, thank you.
Sure. Okay, I don't know if there are any more questions, then I'm happy to answer them. And if not, I think that concludes this workshop.
Thank you so much, Tamar, for making it possible. I think it was a great workshop.
Thank you, very happily. I hope you find it helpful.
Yeah.
Bye.
See you in tournament. Bye.